Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I think my purpose at this point in the hearing is to provide the cornerstones for the privacy interests. When we talk about privacy and liberty after September 11th, people tend to talk about it in the abstract, and they say we should not trade our country's precious freedoms and constitutional liberties for some sense of short-term security. I believe it's extremely important for this Commission to actually understand what the framework of privacy protection is in this country, because that is precisely what is being altered by the many proposals that have been put forward since September 11th, both to give the government new investigative authority and also to give the government new tools of surveillance, not only of people who may pose a threat to the United States, but of citizens in the United States, people who participate in the political process, people come into open public spaces to express their views. These are also the people who become subject to the new systems of surveillance we are establishing after September 11th. But to understand this problem, I think we need to go back in time. I think we need to go back to the late 60s and early 70s, when the Congress undertook an extensive investigation of the surveillance implications of government-based data systems. And after almost 8 years of hearings, Congress passed the Federal Privacy Act of 1974. And what that act did was to establish comprehensive safeguards for people in the United States against the misuse of their personal information held by federal agencies. There was no dispute that the technology would play a critical role in advancing government programs, including law enforcement, nor was there any dispute about the need to establish appropriate safeguards that would ensure that the technology could be used for the benefit of the American public and the American government and still safeguard essential liberties. The Privacy Act of 1974 is the basic framework of privacy protection for the use of personal data in the United States. And it imposes very significant obligations on federal agencies that collect and use personal data. It does this not to frustrate an agency purpose or to add additional burden, but rather to ensure that when personal information is collected by federal government agencies, it is used for an appropriate purpose. Now, the other key cornerstone to think about in assessing privacy protection in the United States is the Federal Wiretap Act. The Wiretap statute was passed in 1968, following perhaps two of the most important privacy cases decided by the United States Supreme Court. One concerned the use of a tape recorder in a public payphone in the streets of Los Angeles, and whether that new investigative method would require the use of a warrant, which is to say judicial approval, or whether law enforcement could be free to use any new form of technology without judicial oversight to gather evidence that could be used in a criminal prosecution. And the court said quite clearly in Katz versus United States that this new type of technology needs to be subject to Fourth Amendment standards. Not that it could not be used or that a prohibition should be established, but rather that the traditional Fourth Amendment standards would be required for electronic surveillance. And the following year, in 1968, when the Congress passed the Federal Wiretap statute, based on Katz and the Berger versus New York opinion, it constructed an elaborate regulatory framework imposing significant oversight responsibilities on federal agencies that were using electronic surveillance authority. Now, given the focus that the Commission has understandably undertaken over the last several months of the mood of the country post-September 11th, I think it's reasonable to consider also the challenges that the United States faced in 1968, when both the Supreme Court and the U.S. Congress enacted such sweeping privacy safeguards. We faced powerful adversaries in China and the Soviet Union. 1968 was the year of a presidential assassination, the slaying of a civil rights leader. There were widespread public protests across this country, unlike anything we've seen in over 2 decades. And yet, at that point in our nation's history, the court and the Congress recognized the need to establish important privacy safeguards for our citizens. Now, I'd be very pleased to speak with you about a number of the developments that have happened post-September 11th, to look at the JetBlue matter, to look at CAPS, and to look at total information awareness. But I would urge you at the outset to consider the important work that has been done prior to 9/11 to establish privacy rights for people in the United States, even during periods of significant turmoil.
Thank you very much. Senator Gordon.